Welcome to Compact Mysteries from CompactHistories.com, the show where we try to unravel a different bite-sized mystery each week, from baffling disappearances and strange objects to unexplained events and mysterious places. This is episode 86, The Mystery of the Sailing Stones of Death Valley. In a remote northern corner of California's Death Valley National Park lies a dry lakebed known as Racetrack Playa. Reaching it requires a long journey over a rough, unpaved road, through country where summer heat, winter cold, and sudden storms can all test an unprepared traveller. The playa itself is an almost perfectly level expanse of pale, cracked mud, roughly 4.5 kilometres long and 2 kilometres wide. Mountains surround the basin, isolating it from the better-known parts of Death Valley and giving the landscape the stillness of an abandoned stage. The racetrack began as a depression with no outlet. Rain and melting snow carried water and fine sediment down from the surrounding slopes, temporarily creating a shallow lake. Because there was no river to drain it, the water could escape only by soaking into the ground or evaporating. Layer after layer of silt and clay settled across the basin. When the water vanished, the mud dried, contracted, and split into the interlocking polygonal patterns that now cover much of the playa. Near its northern end stands the grandstand, a dark outcrop of rock rising conspicuously from the level surface. Yet the formation for which the racetrack became famous lies mainly farther south. Stones that have fallen from the surrounding mountains rest on the playa, and behind some of them stretch long, shallow grooves. A trail may run almost straight, swing through a curve or change direction unexpectedly. In places, several tracks lie side by side as though an invisible procession has crossed the lakebed. The stones vary greatly in size and shape. Some are small enough to lift easily, while others are substantial boulders. The National Park Service records that trails extend as far as about 1,500 feet or 457 meters. Whatever moved the stones, therefore, did more than nudge them once. It transported solid rock across a broad, exposed surface, sometimes over considerable distances, while leaving a continuous account of the journey in the mud. The contrast makes the spectacle especially striking. A stationary boulder appears completely ordinary until the eye follows the line extending from it across the patterned ground. The track transforms the rock from part of the scenery into evidence of an unexplained event. Nothing about the scene initially revealed when this happened. The playa might be dry and apparently unchanged for months or years, and no footprints or animal marks accompanied the tracks. Visitors saw only the result: a rock at the end of a furrow and an empty landscape behind it. The evidence made movement undeniable, but the motion itself remained missing. To discover what had crossed the racetrack, investigators first had to reconstruct a natural event that almost never allowed itself to be witnessed. Accounts of moving stones at the racetrack circulated during the early 20th century, although the phenomenon did not immediately receive sustained scientific attention. One early report has been associated with prospector Joseph Crook, who visited the area in 1915. By the 1940s, geologists were documenting the basin and describing the furrows scored into its surface. The mystery was no longer merely a desert tale. There were measurable tracks, displaced rocks, and repeated signs that the playa periodically changed. In 1948, geologists Jim McAllister and Alan Agnew mapped the racetrack's geology. Their published work briefly discussed the trails and suggested that powerful gusts might propel stones over soft mud. Further observations followed. National Park Service Ranger Lewis G. Kirk recorded the lengths, widths, and directions of numerous furrows in 1952, helping to turn a collection of curiosities into a body of evidence that could be compared. The tracks raised as many questions as they answered. Some ran in broadly similar directions, which suggested that a common force had acted upon several rocks at once. Others diverged, crossed, or curved. Stones of different sizes had moved, but neighbouring stones had not necessarily travelled together. Some trails ended without a rock, possibly because a visitor had removed it, while other rocks appeared to have moved repeatedly. Wind and rain later softened the marks, so investigators could not assume that every visible track came from the same event. Researchers also examined the surface on which the stones travelled. When dry, the playa is hard and resistant, making it difficult to imagine a heavy rock sliding across it. After rain, however, the fine clay becomes wet and exceptionally slippery. This created an obvious opportunity for movement, but also an observational problem. The racetrack's wet surface is fragile, and a person walking onto it would leave deep footprints and damage the very evidence being studied. Storms were infrequent, access was difficult, and the events seemed to occur mainly in cold winter conditions. Similar stone trails elsewhere in the region showed that the racetrack was not unique. At Little Bonnie Playa in Nevada, Thomas Clements investigated comparable furrows and argued in 1952 that wind could move rocks across a wet lake bed. The comparison strengthened the case for an environmental mechanism rather than anything peculiar to one collection of stones. Even so, no researcher had watched a racetrack rock begin its journey. The clues established that water softened the surface and that wind was a plausible source of energy, but they did not show exactly how the force reached stones too heavy to be easily shifted. Attention therefore turned from documenting what had happened to testing the competing explanations for how it could happen. The simplest explanation was that wind pushed the stones directly. Racetrack Playa offers almost no shelter, and air flowing through the surrounding mountains can produce powerful gusts. A wet clay surface would reduce friction, allowing a rock to slide more readily than it could across dry ground. Researchers calculated that the smooth playa could expose protruding stones to strong winds close to ground level. Yet direct wind remained an incomplete answer, particularly for the heaviest rocks and for tracks showing that many stones had changed direction in related ways. Water alone also seemed insufficient. Flooding could loosen or wash sediment, but the lake formed on the racetrack is generally shallow. There was little evidence of currents powerful enough to carry substantial boulders hundreds of meters. Mud might provide the slippery surface, but another force still had to propel the stones. More speculative suggestions, ranging from magnetic effects to human interference, failed to fit the diversity and distribution of the tracks. Ice became the most persuasive additional suspect. Death Valley is famous for heat, but the racetrack stands more than 1,100 meters above sea level. Winter nights can be cold enough for shallow water on the playa to freeze. One theory proposed that thick ice formed around the stones and partly lifted them, reducing their contact with the mud. Wind could then drive floating ice, carrying the embedded rocks across the lake bed like cargo on a raft. Other researchers proposed that the stones did not need to float. A broad sheet of ice might be pushed against them, spreading the wind's force over a much larger area than each rock presented alone. Parallel tracks could record several stones being moved by the same sheet. Curving or diverging trails might result when ice fractured, rotated, or encountered variations in water depth. The theory neatly united the three most credible ingredients: temporary flooding, freezing temperatures, and wind. Experiments added weight to the idea. In one small-scale demonstration, planetary scientist Ralph Lorenz froze a rock into a slab of ice and placed it in water over sand. The ice gave the rock enough buoyancy for a light breeze to move it while the stones scraped a trail below. The result showed that an ice-assisted mechanism was physically possible, although it did not prove that the racetrack stones moved in precisely that fashion. That distinction mattered. Plausibility was not observation, and several versions of the ice theory predicted different depths of water, thicknesses of ice, and relationships between rock and frozen sheet. The mystery had narrowed, but it had not been solved. What investigators needed was a way to monitor the playa continuously without standing on its fragile surface, waiting through years of uneventful weather. Modern sensors and automated cameras finally made that possible. In 2011, Richard Norris and James Norris began a dedicated effort to capture the stones in motion. They worked with Ralph Lorenz, Jib Ray, and Brian Jackson, combining geological observation with instruments capable of recording an event even when nobody was present. Their project required patience because the correct conditions might not occur during any particular winter. The researchers could prepare the experiment, but the desert would decide when to run it. With permission from the National Park Service, the team placed 15 specially prepared rocks on the southern part of the playa. These were not taken from the racetrack. Similar stones were brought from outside the protected area so that natural rocks would not be drilled or otherwise altered. A cavity in each experimental stone held a GPS unit and battery pack, allowing its position and movement to be recorded. Each GPS logger was activated by a simple trigger. The instrumented rock rested close to a magnet fixed in the playa. If the rock moved away, the separation switched the logger into operation. The devices could then capture the time, distance, direction, and speed of travel. This offered something that photographs of old tracks could never provide, a numerical record of motion as it happened. The team also installed a weather station near the playa to measure wind and other conditions. Time-lapse cameras watched the basin, building a visual history of flooding, freezing, and drying. Researchers visited several times each year to maintain the equipment and recover data. Most visits found the stones exactly where they had been left. The empty results were frustrating, but they confirmed why the mystery had survived. A person could spend many days at the racetrack and never encounter the brief combination of events required. Continuous monitoring was therefore essential, replacing the unreliable hope that somebody would arrive at the right moment. The winter of 2013 brought a change. Rain and snow created a shallow pond several centimeters deep in the southern part of the playa. Cold nights froze its surface, while warmer daylight partially melted it. On the 4th of December, the researchers saw fresh trails, but did not directly witness the movement. Evidence suggested that some stones had travelled, yet the decisive moment had once again occurred out of sight. Rather than ending the attempt, the new tracks showed that the natural experiment was active. The pond remained, repeatedly freezing overnight and thawing during the day. Instruments were in position, the surface was wet, and rocks had begun to shift. The investigators returned later that month to a landscape transformed by water and thin ice. On the 20th of December 2013, chance, preparation, and the weather finally aligned, allowing them to see what generations of observers had missed. The morning of the 20th of December was cold enough for a thin sheet of ice to cover the shallow pond. It was not the thick, heavy layer imagined in some earlier theories. The researchers later measured this type of ice at only about 3 to 6 millimeters thick, earning it the description windowpane ice. Beneath it remained liquid water, and below that, the soft clay surface of the playa. As the late morning sun warmed the basin, the sheet began to melt and break into broad floating panels. A light wind, moving at roughly 4 to 5 meters per second, pushed the panels across the pond. When an ice edge reached a stone, pressure built against the rock. The moving panel then shoved it across the slippery mud, carving a narrow furrow behind it. Richard and James Norris were present to witness the movement. It was not violent or dramatic. The rocks progressed at walking speed or more slowly, sometimes at only a few centimeters per second. In the broad desert landscape, such motion could easily escape notice unless an observer was watching the correct stone at precisely the right moment. Ice surrounding the rocks also made their progress difficult to distinguish from a distance. More than 60 natural stones moved during the largest event observed that day. Some travelled only briefly, while others continued for several minutes. The instrumented rocks supplied exact measurements and showed that individual movements could last as long as 16 minutes. Across several events between December 2013 and January 2014, some GPS-equipped stones travelled a total of up to 224 meters and moved on more than one occasion. The observations explained patterns that had previously seemed contradictory. Stones separated by considerable distances could travel along parallel paths because they were being pressed by the same large ice panel. Their tracks might later diverge when that panel fractured into smaller pieces, each driven differently by the wind. A rock could stop while another continued if the ice broke away from it, or if local water and mud conditions changed. No immense gust was necessary because the wind acted on a wide area of ice rather than on the exposed face of the stone alone. Crucially, the rocks were not floating inside thick blocks of ice. The thin panels remained afloat on the shallow water and pushed against the stones from the side. The stones themselves maintained contact with the lakebed, which is why they left visible trails. For the first time, researchers had photographs, eyewitness observations, weather measurements, and GPS records describing the same event. The sailing stones had finally been caught in the act, revealing a mechanism both gentler and more exacting than most earlier explanations had assumed. The sailing stones move only when a precise sequence of conditions develops. First, enough rain or melted snow must reach Racetrack Playa to form a shallow pond. The water must remain long enough for a cold, calm night to freeze its surface, but it cannot freeze into an immovable mass. A layer of ice only a few millimeters thick must form, while liquid water survives beneath it. The following day must bring sunshine sufficient to loosen the ice and break it into floating panels. Finally, a steady but relatively light wind must drive those panels against stones resting in wet, slippery clay. Too little water, ice or wind, and nothing happens. Different conditions may produce a frozen lake, a dry lake bed, or broken ice too small to exert sustained pressure. This demanding combination usually develops in winter and may be absent for years. That rarity explains much of the mystery's longevity. Movement could occur slowly, over minutes, rather than in a sudden leap. The responsible ice might melt, and the pond evaporate soon afterwards, removing the most revealing evidence and leaving only stones and tracks beneath a desert sun. Even somebody visiting immediately after an event might reasonably conclude that the landscape had been dry throughout. Death Valley's reputation for extreme heat also made ice seem less intuitive, although the racetrack's high elevation permits freezing winter nights. The 2013 observations did not mean that every trail ever formed under identical circumstances. Wind acting on especially small stones across very wet mud may sometimes contribute directly, and variations in ice thickness, water depth, and rock shape can affect individual journeys. What the researchers demonstrated was a natural mechanism operating at the racetrack itself and capable of producing the characteristic groups of trails. It replaced an unwitnessed possibility with a recorded event. The discovery also reinforced the importance of protecting the playa. Driving on its surface, walking across it while wet, or removing a stone can leave damage that persists for years and destroys part of the geological record. Visitors are asked to remain on foot, avoid the lake bed when it is muddy, and leave every rock where it lies. The trails are delicate evidence, not permanent scars cut into stone. Racetrack Playa therefore remains mysterious in appearance even though its central puzzle has been solved. Its stones do not move through any hidden force or desert trickery. They sail when water, ice, sunlight, and wind briefly cooperate, each ordinary ingredient arriving in exactly the right order. For decades, investigators searched for a force powerful enough to drive rocks across a barren lake bed. The answer proved almost absurdly delicate. Ice as thin as a window pane, a shallow pool, and a breeze. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Mysteries, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmysteries.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/mysteriescoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.